So for some of you who weren't here the last 2 weeks, I just want to mention that today's sermon is like the third of a trilogy, and the other ones will be posted on YouTube in case you're interested. So today's sermon is called The Evolution of God in the New Testament. Unitarian Universalism draws from 6 sources. The fourth listed is the following: Jewish and Christian teachings, which call us to respond to God's love by loving our neighbors as ourselves. Is that still taping?
I can see your picture.
The red light's on.
Can you see me all right on the screen? Today is Easter, the most holy day of the Christian church. This is also the last day of Jewish Passover, which will end at nightfall tonight. Easter celebrates the resurrection of Jesus, a major tenet in the Christian church, without which it would be difficult to justify or understand the other creeds. He died to atone for the many sins of humanity, but that wasn't the end of the story. He rose from the dead to show that those who believe in him will also have everlasting life. In this sermon, I wish to describe the evolution of God as reported in the New Testament. In doing so, however, I think it is important to understand that the Jesus story evolved over the first few centuries after his death. In Mark, the first of the Gospels written, the original ending was, quote, "Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid." In order to match Mark with the other Gospels and to lend credence to the resurrection story, much later, 11 verses were added describing the various appearances of the risen Jesus. In the early years after the death of Jesus, various Jewish sects rose up who honored Jesus. They kept the stories of the life of Jesus alive through a powerful oral tradition. Most likely, those who had some direct interactions with Jesus shared their stories. Over time, those who knew someone who had known Jesus told their stories. These stories varied greatly, but those hearing the stories almost certainly didn't care too much about the literal accuracy of the stories. Like Jesus, they were Jews. There was no Christian religion. They didn't wear crosses. Crucifixion was shameful. They would not have advertised it any more than we would wear a depiction of an electric chair around our necks. They struggled to make meaning of their lives as Jesus, who honored the life of... They struggled to make meaning of their lives as Jews who honored the life of Jesus. Eventually, some of these stories got written down. As the first generation passed, and there was no longer anyone alive who knew Jesus, and eventually no one alive who knew someone who knew Jesus, they had to rely more and more on the written word. The idea that Jesus was the Son of God over a few centuries evolved into the idea that he was equal to God, and eventually to the concept of the Trinity. The idea that Jesus died to atone for humanity's sins also evolved over time until it became a rigid creed. The Jews didn't have a clear concept of heaven or hell. Sheol, Hades, Gehenna, each describe different concepts of the afterlife. When the Christian church eventually insisted that hell was a place of perpetual torment, it was adopted as a means of controlling the population rather than based on any biblical understanding. Monotheism, the idea that Yahweh was the only God, is not promoted in the Bible. Yahweh never ever claimed to be the only God. Rather, he claimed to be the most powerful one. The Gospels of Mark and John do not mention Jesus as being born of a virgin, nor do they say he was born in Bethlehem. Matthew and Luke promote both, primarily as a way to argue that Jesus fulfilled various prophecies. In fact, Jesus is often referred to in the Bible as Jesus of Nazareth. So there's no reason to believe he was actually born in Bethlehem. He was also referred pejoratively as the son of Mary, implying that she may have been a sex worker. I mention all of these contradictions not to discredit the value of the New Testament, but to provide a context. In the same way as different creeds and tenets evolved over time, the evolution of Yahweh from that of a narcissistic, vindictive, jealous God to a loving Father also occurs. I spoke of Phinehas in last week's sermon, a priest who gained favor from God for stabbing another Israelite and his sexual partner. He was known as having zeal. We meet Saul in the Acts of the Apostles. He was a Pharisee who never met Jesus. He reports how he persecuted the new Jewish sect who paid homage to Jesus of Nazareth, and refers to himself as doing so with zeal, a clear reference to Phinehas. In this sermon, I am drawing heavily from a book entitled The Widening of God's Mercy by the father and son team, Christopher and Richard Hayes. In this book, the authors point the similarity of Saul's work to the vigilantes who patrol the U.S. border of Mexico, the terrorists who fly airplanes into skyscrapers or plant bombs in abortion clinics, and those who carry out mass shootings of immigrants. I would add to this list those who broke into the Capitol and attacked police officers. All of these, including Saul and Phinehas, claim themselves as noble defenders of a righteous cause. The story, of course, doesn't end there. Saul is knocked off his horse by a vision of Jesus and is converted, took on the name of Paul, and used that same zeal, although now in a nonviolent way, to spread the word and eventually to allow Gentiles to join the movement without needing to be circumcised or follow strict Jewish law. In the New Testament, over and over, Jesus makes the extraordinary claim that God is not a wrathful, mean-spirited, power-hungry God, but rather a loving Father. And not just Jesus' Father, but the Father of all humans. Initially, I thought he didn't make a great case for this. What I missed, and which I hope to portray here today, is that the ways in which Jesus cites specific scriptural texts, primarily Isaiah and Jeremiah, that point the way toward a widening of God's mercy. Here are a few examples. Number one, Jesus welcomed tax collectors and sex workers. He brought them into his field, into his fold, into his mercy, and suggests that he did so as a loving father would do. as a reformed God would do. It is important to understand that the concepts we have today for sexual orientation and gender identity were not concepts that those living in the time of Jesus would have understood. Sex workers, on the other hand, were the sexual minority of that time, just as LGBTQIA2S+ are the sexual minorities of our time. Clearly, Jesus welcomed sex workers into his loving embrace, and there's no reason to think he wouldn't also do so to the sexual minorities of our time. Number 2, in the history of the Samaritan, Jesus picked a person who was most hated by the Jews and honors him. By doing so, he expands the idea of the chosen people and implies that the God he worships includes all humans into his love and care. He does something similar by healing a Roman centurion servant. Remember, the Romans were the oppressors of the Jews. He also dined with tax collectors, who were the most hated among the Jews, as they were Roman collaborators. According to Jesus, even they deserved mercy. Number 3, in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 18, we are introduced to Philip. He is on a journey from Jerusalem to Gaza and meets a rich Ethiopian eunuch from the southern Nile region, riding in a chariot, who wishes to be baptized. He is a foreigner. He is a Gentile, not a Jew. At the time, there was a huge disagreement among the early followers of Jesus as to whether Gentiles could be baptized and become united in Christ and become, to quote Paul, a member of the body of Christ. So the fact that he was a Gentile should have given Philip pause. Philip travels along the road with the eunuch, and they pass a body of water. The eunuch says, quote, "What can stand in the way of my being baptized?" Unquote. From Philip's point of view, there are many things standing in the way, including a very specific law as reported in Deuteronomy, which Philip was certainly aware of, which states, quote, "No one whose testicles are crushed or whose penis is cut off shall come into the assembly of the Lord." Perhaps Philip believed, as Jesus instructed in his parable about the Samaritan, that this eunuch was his neighbor. And perhaps he believed, like Paul, who said, "Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law." Romans chapter 13. At any rate, he disobeyed Deuteronomy and baptized the eunuch anyway. Philip appears to understand that some of the restrictive rules set up by Yahweh of old no longer apply. Number 4, the Sabbath was very important to the Jews at the time of Jesus, and there were many rules and regulations around what you could do and not do on the Sabbath. Jesus broke those rules over and over again by healing others on the Sabbath. He justified this by noting that the spirit and intent of these rules was more important than the specificity of them. He quotes Isaiah chapter 58 as follows. Can you see these are some disturbing images coming up, folks. This is from Isaiah. Is not this the fact that I choose? Is not this the fast that I choose? To loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke. Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover them and not to hide yourself from your own kin. Then your light shall bring forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up quickly. Your vindicator shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You shall cry for help, and he will say, Here I am. Watching the scenes of men stripped of their clothing and their identity, herded into planes, and handed off to a life sentence of torment in a prison in El Salvador, without even the pretext of charging them with a crime, and without any possibility of defending themselves, is abhorrent. Jesus doesn't say to forget Yahweh and worship a different God. No, he says we must understand Yahweh differently. He is no longer the tyrant he was, but he has now evolved into a loving father. By quoting Isaiah, Jesus is calling forth a different version of Yahweh than the one who allowed Satan to torture Job. To draw a moment from Young's essay, Answer to Job, Jesus is calling forth a merciful God, a God who has remembered Sophia, the goddess of wisdom, his companion of old, a God who has become aware of his shadow, vindictive, unconscious self, and has allowed his mercy to come forth. Jesus, by healing others on the Sabbath, is making the point that, to quote Hayes, actions done for healing and human wholeness should be welcomed rather than forbidden, even if they appear to violate a particular scriptural prohibition. If the well-meaning attempt to honor God's law leads to hardness of heart and blindness to the need of afflicted people, something has gone badly wrong, unquote. I will conclude by saying something has gone terribly wrong. We are now living in a country where the leadership pretends to be Jesus-loving Christians while acting like Phineas or Saul. They are disappearing men because of their tattoos without any chance for them to defend themselves, reneging on international promises to provide food and medicine to the war-torn and poverty-stricken, denying trans folks their basic identity, trampling First Amendment rights of those who criticize them, denying basic health care to millions who can't afford it, and bullying and mocking hardworking folks while lining their pockets with their spoils. They are doing all this while claiming that empathy and compassion are anti-Christian values. This is the country we are now living in. We must condemn these actions, whether from the point of view of humanistic ethics or from the teachings of Jesus, and we must find effective ways to resist.